Popularly dubbed the Tiger Mum, she is controversial and inspiring. Amy Chua is a celebrity law professor at Yale and the best-selling author of this parenting memoir and other books on identity politics, political tribalism, and globalization. And she is worried about the future of today's youth.
The scary thing is that I see among the younger generation now a real turning away from the founding story. I have many students, really bright, but they feel out of touch with the Constitution.
Conversations on the Future is an attempt to rise above the noise of the daily news cycle and focus on longer-term issues that we should be aware of. In this conversation, I spoke with Amy Chua about America's politics, about ethno-nationalism, and Generation Z.
It's weird, I see my words, some of the words I wrote in 2017, and I predicted at the time, I thought I was being ominous. I said, if we keep going in this direction, we are going to see, lurches towards authoritarianism. And I said, the erosion of trust in institutions and electoral outcomes. And it hadn't all happened yet. This is before, President Trump was elected, and then before President Biden was elected, and this is exactly what we've seen since then. So it's pretty disturbing.
So you work with, you have your students, you work with young people constantly. Do you detect optimism, or do you worry about the converse, the death of optimism?
The first thing I want to say is that I'm very conscious that at Yale, my students are largely cosmopolitan elites. It's a huge problem. It's not just Yale, it's all of the top universities. And that actually is literally part of the problem. Another big rift we have, we have so many different group divisions now. There's black versus white. There's a fracturing within the left, so that, my students, it used to be, let's have Asian Americans with South Asians, with Black Students Association, with, the Outlaws, the gay group. Let's all have a party. No. Everybody wants to be completely segregated now. So there are ethnic and racial divisions that are hardening, but another huge divide that is also, I think, new in its intensity is what I would call the division between cosmopolitan elites. They're not always coastal, but they often are. People who attend fancy schools, who live in major cities, who view themselves as the height of tolerant. Those people, on the one hand, which include a lot of immigrants and black, white, all races, and on the other hand, America's rural, working class, Southern population, many of them white working class, but not entirely. You can see a lot of Hispanic Americans actually are allied with this group, and they form, what would be called President Trump's base. And the difference between these two groups now is so intense. That is almost no intermarriage between them. Yeah. So this is a weird thing to say, but you can learn a lot about group dynamics from dating apps. Mm-hmm. So my young students they will say, dating apps, Trump supporters need not apply. And once you get to that situation, I've studied a lot about the definition of what is an ethnic group, and the level of intermarriage is actually one marker. So if you're in a situation where the cosmopolitan, coastal, urban elites are not interacting or intermarrying with any of the rural, Southern, working class whites, you start to get into a situation that it's more like an ethnic divide. And I think that is something that I would say I'm worried about. And the more positive twist to that is that I do think that there could be a silent majority. I'm a really controversial person. Based on what you read about me, you would expect nobody to take my class. I have the longest wait lists, at the law school. So I feel like there's a silent majority that kind of actually wants debate. They want to hear the other side, because that's kind of what I'm committed to promoting. I say on day one, in this class, it's very diverse, but we will air our views. And if you hate something that somebody else said, don't go straight to thinking it was racist. Express your unhappiness, and we'll have a conversation. So I don't know, on good days, I feel hopeful. I would say the majority of times right now, I'm a little worried. We have a lot of unhappiness, and I've never seen my students more tense and more miserable. So that's a bad sign.
We've seen a lot of anger in the younger generation globally as well. Glasgow saw an incredible turnout, and you've had the emergence of Generation Z. So where is all this anger going to go? Which direction is it going to go in?
This is actually my latest research project. I have 15 research assistants looking at this. I'm really interested in Gen Z. And this is very still inchoate in my mind, but I see this particular moment as in some ways very parallel to the late 1960s and 1970s in the United States. Today, as back in the late 60s and 70s, there was an enormous crisis of confidence among the young people. You know, back then, it was the Vietnam War. It was young people saying, wait a minute, we've got the Mad Men generation, and they have decided to start a war in which they don't have to go fight. It's only us young people, who newly drafted, including the elites, who have to go and die for a war that we do not believe in. And at the time, there was the atomic bomb. So there was this feeling like this stupid, out-of-touch, older generation has led us to this crisis, and we feel this existential threat. Their decisions will lead to us being wiped out, And today, when you mention climate change, a lot of the protests, I see a lot of the same dynamics. A student has documented for me how the young generations, not just Gen Z, but millennials, together, they wield disproportionately tiny political power relative to their numbers. You look at our Senate and just the whole Congress, and President Biden he's an older man, and it's just a much older generation that seems to control politics, seems to control the Supreme Court. And their view is just very similar to the 60s. Like, this is an out-of-touch generation. We are saddled with massive student debt, massive national debt. They can't afford housing now. This is a real problem. They don't see any responses they're satisfied with respect to global warming, just tiny incremental things. On the other hand, in the 60s and 70s, we also saw backlash, right? So we have all this youth revolution, the hippies, the protests, free love, and of course, what do you get in response to that? The rise of Reaganism, the war on drugs. You get the rise of the religious right. And I see a lot of parallels today, in response to George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, what a lot of us thought was going to be a shift of the Overton window. Look, everybody was horrified by the George Floyd killing. So the distortion I see on TV, I don't even know what they're talking about, but very disturbingly, you see a lot of whites not just pushing back, because, the rhetoric does sometimes go too far, which is whites, you're worthless, you everything about you is bad, it's all white supremacy, you're genocide, you're responsible for genocide, and that's it. So, the response is kind of a natural psychological response for a lot of people. I understand it. It's, no, we're not that bad. In fact, we founded this country. In fact, we've done a lot of good things. And so I see that backlash now, and it's not a very healthy situation to have such vicious vitriol in both directions. So that's kind of what I'm looking into. I don't have the answers. It's not that we never make progress one way or the other, but I think depending on how vicious the rhetoric is and what kinds of demagogues you get, you also see backlash that has to be factored in.
You have internal divisions, you have external pressure, external threats and all that. Do you think the United States is going to cohere, hang together 50 years from now? What do you see?
I don't know if you remember, my least known book was a book called Day of Empire that I wrote in 2007. It was about how hyperpowers rise to global dominance and why they fall. And the thesis was that the central thing that linked, Rome at its greatest, or the Great Britain at its greatest, or also less well-known empires like the Persian Empire, in 330 BC, or the Dutch Republic for a very short time when it rose to global dominance. What I found was that in all these cases, every single one of these hyperpowers, and by that I mean something very specific, basically a power that essentially dominated the world, so it's not just a superpower, but like a hyperpower. And I found that the common link was that in every case, these powers were extremely tolerant and open on their rise to global dominance. And fast forward to the modern era, it's not about conquest anymore. It's basically about being able to pull in the best and the brightest. And, I make different arguments about how that was the case. You don't usually think of the British Empire as being tolerant, but I mean tolerant in a very unique sense. And, they were able to draw in a lot of elites from different parts of their empire. They built this huge British army around the world. In the case of the United States, it's been pulling in the world's best and brightest. And, I think that that's how the U.S. moved from a small ragtag set of colonies to an industrial power, to a superpower. Silicon Valley is like 60%, sort of immigrants or the children of immigrants, founders of those big startups. And the scary part of this thesis is the decline part. What I also found is that in every one of these cases, the decline of these great hyperpowers coincided with a sharp turn to xenophobia and intolerance. And I don't need to tell you, if you look at the United States, it's quite different from the way it was when we elected Barack Obama. It's so much anti-immigration sentiment, anti-China, anti-Mexico, anti-Muslim, it's a real hunkering down and in a kind of very open way. I always remain an optimist. I do believe that we have something special and secret, and that is that the U.S. national identity is founded on not ethnicity or blood or a certain nationality, but the U.S. Constitution, a set of principles. So in theory, our national identity is ethnically and religiously neutral from the beginning. Now, the way that actually played out was so far from perfect. We never, ever lived up to those ideals. But that foundational ideal, I think, gives us actually a really good sort of, I think that foundational structure actually puts us, the United States, in a better way, in a better position to deal with a lot of these problems that arise from diversity. The scary thing is that I see among the younger generation now a real turning away from the founding story. I have many, many students, really bright, but they feel out of touch with the Constitution. They say, oh, that document was just written by a bunch of old white males who kept slaves. Why should we listen to this? So there are a lot of pressures on the United States coming from all directions, from the young generation, from external threats, from groups threatened that they're going to lose their dominance, kind of everywhere.
To round off, I'm curious about your views about this other huge geopolitical competition which the United States faces, and it's cast as this competition with China. And of course, as we know, the world has not seen a power like China rise for a very long time, and it's a peer competitor and so forth. Do you think that these two powers can coexist without getting drawn into?
On a global level, I sense this when I talk to my Chinese students, that it's significantly worse than 15 years ago. We have the China Law Center at Yale Law School. And I remember 15 years ago, it felt like everything was moving towards harmony. We had all these students going over there, students coming over here, lots of Westerners speaking Mandarin. That moment has passed. Partly the pandemic. Maybe we can begin to get back to a different time. My ethnic heritage is Chinese, and I was raised with a huge amount of pride in the civilization. Kind of a funny anecdote, I grew up here in the 60s and 70s, and I grew up first 8 years of my life in the Midwest. And I was the only Asian kid, in my class, probably in the whole neighborhood. People ran around making slanty eyes. I had an accent. I was such an outsider. And yet it was better back then being a Chinese American because, I was a good student and people were not threatened by Asians. Today, ironically, even though or maybe because there's so many more Asians here, I would say it is the hardest time in my life to be a Chinese American here. it's coming from both the left and the right. The left is outraged at China's human rights record. The right, with the pandemic and the kind of geopolitical threats. And then internally, so many Caucasian Americans are worried about university spots and school spots. They're threatened for their children. And you read in the United States about poor 70-year-old Asian Americans just being punched and pushed into subways. So it's a really personal question for me. And I think one problem is that it's impossible to get good information. I was just, I did an event, a kind of a podcast for a pretty cosmopolitan Chinese show, not at all affiliated with the government, quite critical. And I was able to speak pretty honestly, but I noticed that the Chinese participants who were from major Chinese universities, they spoke very intelligently. We had a lot in common. We talked about tribalism, the worries about social media. But what was so interesting is that I felt that we were talking about different worlds. For example, they said, well, of course, the Chinese are much, much more open to ideas than, the United States. And they said things like, of course, it's the U.S. news media is completely, unreliable and filled with disinformation. So it was like a mirror image. What I read about China in this country was being repeated back to me by the Chinese scholars. And I'm trying to say this, Norma, without getting into the basics, without getting into the truth of it, right? Because I think that's exactly the problem, to try to, without saying on which fact is, who's right on which fact. It's more that we are living in different universes. So just as you turn on Fox News, the conservative TV station, and MSNBC, the progressive one, and the news is as if you're talking about two different countries, I felt like we were talking about two different worlds, So, there was at the end the hopeful part, which we all talk about. All these studies, sociological, psychological, that show that if you can just get people to interact on a one-on-one level as individuals, before their political or global affiliations, you just get two people together and you first talk about pets, or food, or movies, or flowers, or sports. I mean, there's so many things that we share in common. We all are fearful for our children. We're all afraid of death. We all love nature. There's so many things. The ocean is beautiful in multiple languages. Studies show that if you can get people to talk at that level for a bit first, and then you introduce their political affiliations, everything is so much better, So the question is, how can we get to that? And it is a chicken and egg problem, when people are so suspicious right now.
Well, anyway, on that note, Amy Chua, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure always to speak with you. Thank you for joining Conversations on the Future.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such a pleasure.